Yeah. All right, can everyone on Zoom here? I think so. So, thanks everyone for coming. I'm Martha, Esther, co-president of the Bullitt History of Medicine Club. So we're co-presenting narrative medicine with Dr. Janet Downie. We're co-presenting that with University Libraries. Dr. Downie will give the presentation, then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. And Esther, do you want to introduce Dr. Downie? Okay. Or if you want to give a little bit of background before you start your presentation, that would be great too.
Yes. So when I'm speaking, I'm obviously speaking about you. Is anywhere else supposed to speak?
We're on Zoom, but the cameras are up, so yeah.
That's my okay. Great. Thank you so. Oh yeah, I can hear it now. Okay. Great. Let me just find my things here. Make sure. Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks so much to everyone for being here, to Esther for the invitation, which is the explanation of where I'm coming from. I teach in the classics department at UNC, so in the College of Arts and Sciences. I work on ancient Greek literature, and with a particular interest in some of the medical texts of the imperial period, the Roman imperial period, earlier texts as well. I'm teaching a course right now on ancient medicine. Some of you know about that. When Esther was in our department as an undergraduate, I was also teaching some courses, research-based courses actually for undergraduates, interested in the early history of medicine in the Mediterranean context and in the Greek and the Roman and the Latin context in particular. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And it's a great pleasure to be here with the Bullitt Society for the History of Medicine, or Bullitt History of Medicine Club. I've attended a couple of these lectures on Zoom actually during the pandemic, which was really great. So I had just a tiny bit of contact with the organization before this. And it's really been exciting, especially talking with Raul Nicochea about the way that humanities is part of the curriculum in the medical school and in the training of physicians. And a lot of that is kind of embedded in some of the stuff I'll talk about today. My expertise is, of course, in the ancient texts. But what I was trying to do with this paper and with this research was to look at how some of the ideas about narrative medicine and the ways that people are talking about narrative medicine in medicine-based and medical humanities-based publications, how some of those ideas kind of help us to think about some of the unusual texts from the ancient world that have to do with how people talk about their bodies, not as experts so much as patients or as humans or as individual people. And those kinds of texts are really rare in the ancient world. And so the few that I brought to you today, there's not a ton more where that came from. They're really unique. And so really interesting material evidence for people like myself working in ancient studies to think about. So I need to know how to navigate. How do I navigate? Okay. Yeah, got it. Okay. That's it. So part of how I got into this particular talk was through reading, actually, I think during the pandemic, and actually, I think when I was at home with spinal meningitis, this relatively recent book by Anne Boyer called The Undying. And this is a memoir, it's a personal account written by a woman, published in 2019, who was diagnosed with breast cancer and talks her way through the experience of that. And there were many things I found really interesting in this book. One of the things was that she actually quotes some of the ancient authors that I'll talk about in this paper, which is really, really surprising because nobody knows Elias Aristides, essentially. So when I came across this memoir and saw that she had kind of gotten into the 2nd century CE Roman period author who writes an account of illness, I was intrigued. But she's writing, of course, in the 21st century. I've got a brief quotation up on the screen here. She's talking here about what it is to tell the story of having cancer. Only one class of people who've had breast cancer are regularly admitted to the pink-washed landscape of awareness, to the polemical. Those who have survived it. To those victors go the narrative spoils. And part of her point in this memoir, I don't know if other people have read it or have come across it, but part of her point is sort of she's taking on some of the biomedical industrial complex and talking about what it is like to interact with that system and that infrastructure in the modern world. So you can see, the 5K runs, the organic green smoothie, the positive thought, and so on. Breast cancer's industrial etiology, medicine's misogynist and racist histories and practices, capitalism's incredible machine of profit. She spends a lot of time on that. All these kinds of things are omitted, she says, from breast cancer's now common literary form. So in some ways, it's kind of an indictment from a personal perspective of the modern medical industrial complex. But she's also really interested in what it is to make narrative out of illness. So this idea of what is a literary form for talking about breast cancer? How do we do that in literature? How do we talk about pain? How do we talk about illness in literature? She was interested in some of the questions that I was interested in. And in some ways, I'm interested in them from this far back. Is this something people talk about in medical schools, the Hippocratic triangle at all? No. Okay. Maybe Kinda, in different words. Maybe first do no harm, right, is one of the big sort of Hippocratic aphorisms that makes its way into the modern world. But this, I mean, this is in, you know, some of the literature on narrative medicine people are interested in, and you can sort of visualize maybe how Anne Boyer is interested in this triangulated relationship, her relationship as patient to her physicians, her relationship as patient to her illness, the interest of the physicians in her illness, what is the nature of that interest, how do they talk about it? And all of this for Anne Boyer, for example, is mediated by, you know, endless blood tests and machines and so on and so forth. But this is an idea or a sort of a question that goes way back to the Hippocratic corpus, to the 5th century BCE. We see writers talking about this. The art of medicine consists of 3 parts: the diseased, and the physician. Sorry, diseased, and the physician. The physician is servant of the art, the diseased fights against the disease with the physician. Lots to talk about in those different relationships, but you get the picture, and with the arrows, you get the picture that people are going to talk about these interactions in different ways. There's lots of 20th century and 21st century kind of reflection on what I would call the Hippocratic triangle, or that triangulated relationship. In memoir and fiction, in books, this is a quite extraordinary, to me, account by John Berger, with photographs, and I've used a few of them here by John Moore, of a country doctor in the sort of middle 20th century in rural England. Quite a different context from how many of us, you, practice medicine now, but there he's really interested, the 2 of them are really interested in, like, the triangle. This is not an isosceles triangle, right? It's not all equal, but that relationship between the physician, the patient, and the illness or the condition or whatever is being treated here. Another kind of great image from that book. And the photographs are incredible. They kind of speak for themselves about this kind of intertwined relationship. So with Anne Boyer in mind and the Hippocratic triangle, if we want to take that, I want to take that out of Hippocratic texts. What I was interested in looking at with this piece of research in this this paper was, like, what does the Hippocratic triangle look like in an ancient context? If it can look something like this in a mid-20th century rural context, and you all could imagine what that triangle looks like now, you know, in your practice or in your thinking about medicine in the 21st century in this building with this view, right? This triangle is going to look different at different times and places. So what did that look like in the ancient world? And a little bit of a roadmap to the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we can vaguely, faintly hear the voices of ancient patients, and then what some of the things are that modern theories of narrative medicine can offer for thinking about that interaction. And then we'll look briefly at 3 extraordinary, rare, unusual examples of narrative medicine from the ancient world. So patient perspectives. I was just brainstorming here for modern patient perspectives. You all can fill that out much better than I can. But, like, where do patients enter into the medical encounter now? And where do we see their traces, like in the chart, in the case history, and so on? In the ancient context, the material that we're talking about here from 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago from the ancient Mediterranean, we don't actually have a lot of material to work with. A lot of what's preserved is preserved by accident, or is preserved by doctors who are most interested in their angle of the triangle, right? But here are some of the ways that we do get patient perspectives from the ancient world in drama and fiction, in votive images and inscriptions, and in medical case histories. So I'll just give you a little glimpse of each of those so you can kind of put them in place. Greek tragedy does feature lots of people in pain, suffering, often physically. This is probably a depiction of Philoctetes, who gets left in an island with a stinky suppurating foot after a snake bite. The real point of the play has to do with sort of social isolation and how he is or is not connected with his fellow Greek warriors. And here you have Neoptolemus and Odysseus, two of his fellow fighters on the trip to Troy, kind of trying to figure out where Neoptolemus is now, talking about his grievous sore, describing it in some graphic detail. And Philoctetes does appear in that play, kind of making some wails and agonizing sounds. So yeah, in Greek tragedy, you have signs of sort of some rendition of what it is to experience illness. But that's sort of fictional writing, right? It's not really first person experience. You also have in the ancient world cults. So religious practices, ritual practices. This is a depiction of the temple of Asclepius at Epidaurus. And people would interact with these temple contexts, seeking healing for various parts of their body, and expressing either wishes or gratitude for healing by leaving votive dedications at the temple site. So there's a religious context in which people in the ancient world can express some of what their experience is with illness and their experience is with healing. So that was tragedy. This is votive offerings. Here's another example of a votive offering. Here telling a little bit of a story of healing. A person who's ill seems to be sleeping in the temple. He is bitten by a snake or healed by the gods. This is part of that temple iconography. It looks here like the god perhaps has come to him. Like this is a symbolic representation, right, of what someone experienced religiously. The god has come to him and healed him, same spot, right? God, snake. And then he leaves a tablet just like this. You can see the tablet in the back of the frame reflecting on his experience. So people were self-reflective about healing experiences in these religious contexts. This is 5th or 4th century BCE. Sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus again. Here is some written account of healings that took place in that sanctuary, but they're written up by the temple priests. So that's, some kind of evidence for patients, but it's been processed by the temple industrial context, right? Temple industrial complex, probably to sell their services. So this kind of access that we get to patients is mediated. It's mediated too when we talk about medical texts. So the kinds of highbrow, educated, theory and practice, but heavily theoretical texts that come out of the Hippocratic tradition and the Galenic tradition. So a long tradition there, working its way through Arabic into medieval sources in Western Europe, into Latin and so on, coming out of the Greek. So it's a very complex mode of access for us to get back to some of what these very ancient 2,500 years ago doctors were thinking. And when they're thinking, they're kind of thinking about patients, but they're kind of thinking about how they're trying to figure out what's wrong with their patients, how to understand it, how to fit patients into sort of the theories that they're presenting in these texts. So patient voices in medical texts from the ancient world are kind of hard to see or hard to hear. In the Hippocratic corpus, there are texts that relate case histories. So you've got an example up in the top left there. And you can see Phoenix, this is the person. The writer, the physician writer says, it seemed to him that many lights like lightning flashed from his right eye. So I guess Phoenix is telling him that, right? A little glimpse of a patient voice. After a short time, a terrible pain developed in the right temple. Well, I guess Phoenix is telling him that too, right? But this is a very mediated kind of patient voice. On the right, this is another image from the Berger and Moore book depicting, right, a contemporary or 20th century patient, right, trying to communicate, presumably, with the physician, see the back of his head here, about what she is experiencing. So again, the ancient material, we have to read between the lines to hear the voices of patients. Partly because you can see in the physician's language here, another Hippocratic text, physicians can be quite dismissive of patients. Patients don't know what they're suffering from. They don't know why they're suffering from it. They don't know what's going to happen next, right? So their testimony or their experience is not very valuable. They don't have the kind of experience that a doctor has over a whole series of cases. They're simply looking for alleviation of pain immediately. So the physicians who write these ancient texts give us a little bit of a glimpse of a patient voice, but it's heavily mediated and it's often kind of negative vis-a-vis what they think is their sort of more comprehensive global experience. There are some interesting, it's not really exceptions, but like interesting ways in which that physician perspective goes a bit deeper. And this figure, Archigenes of Apamea, Roman period writer, is really interesting because he seems to have back up. We only know about what he thought and what he wrote from Galen. So again, layers upon layers of trying to see what's going on. But Archigenes, it looks like, used pain or tried to use pain as a diagnostic method or a diagnostic approach. He tried to correlate pain with different organs in the body. And he tried to sort of codify the language of pain, apparently in an attempt to try to mediate that patient experience into something that could be usable and digestible for him as a physician. And some of this would have been based on patient words and patient testimony, but it looks like, building on Lewis's article here, it looks like it also had to do with what the physician could observe. So again, Hippocratic triangle, like the physician and the patient, it's a bond, right? It's a kind of intercommunication that keeps working, also interconnected with the illness. But look at Archigenes' terms: numb, adherent, salty for pain. Oh, I have an adherent pain. We try to do that now, right? We try to quantify pain. You all, as physicians, try to quantify pain or ask patients to do that. Rate your pain on scale. I'd never seen the picture one, so I had to add that, put that in. And then the McGill pain questionnaire, right? That's a really interesting thing to look at next to Archigenes' attempt to do something similar, right? He wasn't going to tally up all the numbers and give you a score and so on. But that idea of trying to use language to get at what the experience of pain is like for the individual. So that's a little bit of a glimpse of where we hear and don't hear or struggle to hear patient voices in the ancient world. What can narrative medicine and contemporary thinking about narrative medicine do to kind of help us sift through some of this? Obviously, Rita Charon is an important figure in sort of thinking about narrative medicine. Probably people have come across her name. She and Kleinman are sort of big names in the late 20th century sort of conversation about narrative medicine. And she talks about narrative medicine partly as a form of witnessing, so trying to hear patients, like Archigenes, trying to hear patients, and trying to hear especially like the patient's body in conversation with the patient's self. So she seems to be trying to listen in. I, the witness, listen. And part of what the aim in Charon's interest in narrative medicine seems to have been is really to try to use the patient's, what's the word, self-knowledgeable understanding of their own pain, use that as a physician, by listening closely, use that as a physician to help the patient. And there are other people who have sort of explored this in different ways. Arthur Kleinman, Abraham Verghese, who is also kind of well known these days for his fiction. And you can see from this little quotation from Verghese, then the question for people interested in narrative medicine is also, like, what is exactly is the relationship between the physician and the patient in this encounter? So he describes himself as a physician, as a player in other people's stories. He realizes, like, you can't just kind of silently listen and witness, right? Verghese seems to know that the physician is also a player in the patient's story, is affecting that interaction and that triangular relationship. Some have objected, though, like this article by Nussbaum, have objected that puts too much attention back on the physician. Bergaze is trying to tell his own story now, not the patient's story, would be the criticism. And then there are other ways of looking at it in this article by Siddiqui, looking at the Berger and Moore book. He's interested in this question of pain work and whether there can be a kind of close, reciprocal, empathetic bond between patient and physician, so that this communication like acknowledges two different perspectives, but is sort of not just fruitful, but like mutually engaged, I guess. So with those kinds of like questions about narrative medicine, the basics of narrative medicine from Charon, and then questions about like how would you actually approach thinking about narrative medicine. Here are the examples that I brought for today from the ancient world to try to look at what narrative medicine looks like in an ancient context. First example is a letter exchange between Fronto and Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is an emperor, and Fronto is his teacher of rhetoric. The second example is a personal diary by Elias Aristides. That's the figure that Anne Boyer referred to in her book. And then a funerary inscription for this little Lucius guy. He's a small child, he died. So we'll look at these three examples. And what I'm interested in here, kind of thinking about where narrative medicine seems to be at these days, to me, looking at it from the outside. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. You know, if you're engaging this in contemporary context, what does narrative medicine look like to you now? Part of what I'm seeing is that people are increasingly interested in narrative medicine as a process of interaction between physician and patient, as a process for the patient themselves, and as a process that doesn't have to aim at interpretive closure, doesn't have to yield a diagnosis or help with diagnosis and treatment, as Charon might have been thinking about it. So, quite a few passages. This is text heavy, and we don't have to look at all of this in great detail, but this is to give you a feel for what's going on in these primary sources. This is in translation, and I've highlighted some of the places where the author is sort of talking in medical terms. So what's extraordinary about each of these texts is they go into medical detail, and they do them in different kinds of contexts. So this is Fronto, the teacher, writing to Marcus Aurelius, the emperor. He says, I've had such an attack that I lost my voice, gasped and struggled for breath. My circulation failed. I had no pulse, was imperceptible. I became unconscious. I was given up by my family as dead and remained insensible for some time. And then he goes on about the efforts to relieve his symptoms, how he's feeling now, that his voice is getting stronger. And then he's sort of thinking about what he's going to do in the coming days. It's a bit weird. It's a bit weird to write like that, even in this period. And scholars have really struggled to understand why he goes into so much detail about his physical symptoms. In part, this does seem to be, for Fronto and Marcus Aurelius, a way of forging a bond between the two of them, an affective bond. And so here we see narrative and medical narrative and bodily narrative working to forge these interpersonal connections between a teacher and a student. He also, okay, some of these letters are very brief, and some of them are basically just about severe pain in his groin. I leave you to sort of ponder that, right? I mean, scholars ponder this. People have speculated what kind of relationship they had, that they speak this intimately to one another. There's a book, Marcus Aurelius in Love. Some have speculated that this was like an erotic relationship. That's highly, it's debatable. But the level of detail is striking. And remembering what distress, that pain causes you, I feel anxiety. There is a kind of love relationship here. And so that here pain and the body are being used to bring these people closer together. At the same time, this is a different translator, I'm sure you can tell, right? Hi, my sweetest teacher. Oh, well, I slept late because I had a little chill, which seems to have calmed down. I did some reading and then wrote less lamely, Lordy, than yesterday. I don't remember what the Latin is in there, but right, the translator's trying to get this colloquial feeling that is in the letter. And then what happens? After I said good morning to my father, I coddled my chops with honey and water by sucking it into my gullet, then tossing it out. Far be it from me to say I gargled. It's ignobious. This is in group taught. This is playing around with Greek and Latin and words, medical vocabulary and learned vocabulary. So there's also a kind of playing to, you could say, sort of the medical establishment here inside this personal relationship that is being built through letters and through graphic physical detail. Okay, so personal connection, humor, kind of drama in all of this. Here's a little glimpse of them playing with terminology between Greek and Latin. He's sort of alluding cleverly to Greek terminology for medical and bodily stuff. Okay, example 2, Elias Aristides, the Sacred Tales is kind of a long text. It's autobiographical, which is very, very strange in the ancient world. This is from 200 CE, so a little less than 2,000 years ago. And this is someone who is writing in detail, as you can see from the passage here, about his own physical condition. He's describing here a tumor or a growth in his body. He's describing its size, that his groin was distended, that everything was swollen, that he had terrible pains. And in Aristides' account, the most important sort of figure in his healing and his description of himself as healing is the god Asclepius. So this is a temple context. Temple of Asclepius, sanctuary of Asclepius, this time at Pergamum. But remember back to that temple context I showed you earlier, he's participating in a long tradition of going to the god's sanctuary, staying there and receiving divine healing. As he says at the end, there's no choice between listening to the doctors or listening to the god. So he has medical attendants, he has physicians, he has the Hippocratic type doctors or Galenic type doctors. But here he is using his illness narrative also to stage a competition between physicians and learned physicians and divine medicine. He plays this up in graphic detail. And this is the thing that has been sort of the stumbling block for scholars with this text. Enemas in a literary text for publication by someone who thinks rather highly of himself, as you can see in the statue on the right. So graphic physical detail, illness descriptions, and therapeutic descriptions are playing some role in how he is presenting himself to the world. This is a very public text. This is not for building a personal relationship like Fronto and Marcus Aurelius. This is a performance for an audience, and he makes illness part of that performance, staging his healing as a competition between the gods, or the god and the doctors. And he also claims that his physical experiences, his illness and his divine healing contribute to his professional success. This is a model of the sanctuary complex that Aristides was staying in, looking for divine healing. And again, just the detail here, his indescribable ailments, he says they're indescribable. He goes on to describe them in graphic detail. My intestines swelled and my breathing was blocked and there are purges and so on. I mean, the level of medical detail in here, scare quotes, level of physical detail is extraordinary. He gets a surgery farther down in this passage. You can see the doctor's making an incision and he feels like his intestines are cold and hanging out. So here, like, is one of the rare, super rare places in ancient literary evidence where we have a patient describing the feeling of being ill and kind of graphically ill. It's really an extraordinary text. More description of his illness. Here, he's kind of waxing poetic. He describes this, again, indescribable feeling as being drawn backward like a sail billowing in the wind, so kind of pulling in some poetic metaphor to make an impression. And still it's graphic. And he ends up, screaming, perspiring, with looseness in his bowels and faintness. Okay, so third example is an epitaph, a funerary epitaph for a very young child. This is an image of the inscription. So again, this is public. Like Aristides' text, this is a text that addresses a public. It's meant to be read by passersby. It's meant to commemorate the death of the child. And here is the inscription, again, in translation. The inscription is erected or put up by his parents. You can see in the first line, they call themselves unfortunate parents. And they refer to Lucius as their sweetest child. He lived 4 years, 5 months, and 20 days, the first few lines of that inscription. And then what happens? It's the voice of the baby. Of course, it's the parents channeling the voice of the baby and asking for this inscription to be put up. But it's a very interesting move, right, to put this inscription in the voice of the deceased person. Actually, that in itself is not uncommon in the ancient world, to have the dead person speaking through the funerary inscription from the grave. What is unusual, though, is the level of physical detail about the baby's illness, death, and also the death process and illness process within the family. I should say, too, that this is verse, it's poetry. So it's meant to be public, and it's also meant to be poetic, impressive, beautiful. This is elevated writing. And poetry invokes a poetic vocabulary. This is in Greek, and the language, some of the language in here is Homeric, is literary, is special Greek language. So the parents have made a poem in the voice of their deceased baby, in which he describes rather graphically, the baby describes rather graphically his illness. He talks about the birthing pains of his mother. First of all, the mother and father kind of come into the picture really importantly here, and talk about the father's care for the baby and integration of the baby into the family. So this is a family unit that we're meant to imagine. And then he's afflicted with a terrible illness around the testicles. But the long-suffering Father who begat me healed my illness, thinking to save my fate with medicine. People have wondered whether the Father was a physician for various reasons, including that line, but it's not entirely clear. And then more illness ensues, most pernicious, many times worse, and then a decay in the bones of his left foot, with the result that his father and his friends, the father's friends, take out the bones. So some kind of surgery, it seems to be described. Graphic detail about the illness, description of some kind of surgery, and then after more description of belly illness or intestinal or digestive illness, the hands of my mother took my life from my eyes. So you have a kind of birth to death picture of this baby inside the family, the mother birthing him, the mother taking life away, the father trying to interact with the body of the baby in illness along with his friends, and all of this monumentalized. It's a really, really unusual piece of writing. And although it isn't first person for obvious reasons, since a dead person and a small baby, they're channeling the voice of that baby to tell this story. So this, again, it's a really unusual piece of writing from the ancient world. And here, I would just say to come back now to questions of narrative medicine, reading this, and in fact, rereading it, this week and thinking about this presentation and getting a little bit further into some of the conversations about narrative medicine, it occurs to me to think, we might want to think about this as a kind of intersubjective pain narrative, the way that the parents and the baby are sort of trading voices here, and the parents are attempting to feel their way into the experience of the infant, deceased infant. So where does that leave me with thinking about narrative medicine and these texts? As I said sort of at the outset, I'm interested in how people engage with narrative medicine are interested in process more than interpretive closure. It's hard to draw conclusions from the texts that I've shown you, the ancient texts, but one of the things that they're all invested in is the idea of making room for an aesthetic encounter around illness. Like an aesthetic encounter that involves us looking at the illness, the details, the graphic details of the illness, and in some cases, say Aristides or Fronto Marcus Aurelius, like working through that in writing, in literature. So these are some of the articles and references that I found interesting recently for thinking about this, especially Liatsos, and I sort of summarized a little bit of Liatsos's argument at the top of the slide, where he's interested in the way that narrative medicine can create room for an aporetic experience of medicine. So an experience of medicine that doesn't necessarily have a resolution, that doesn't necessarily have a diagnosis, a treatment, an outcome, right? But is part of the process of thinking about pain in the body and the patient's experience. So back to Anne Boyer, to come to a conclusion, this is sort of what she was interested in this book, the question of how to write about cancer in the modern industrial medical complex context. She doesn't want to turn pain into a product. In fact, she resents everyone else turning her pain into a product, and she's trying to find a way to write that resists that kind of appropriation of her story. And this last bit, she describes her friend telling her that what she needs is not comfort, but art. So it was to get through cancer that I had to wish everything around me into aesthetic extremity. And so she engages in this book with the kind of aesthetics of illness, or engages with the illness experience in a way that she's trying to think it through in writing without coming to the kinds of conclusions that the medical complex is imposing on her as she experiences it. So we'll leave us there with Anne Boyer, having come kind of full circle and having given you just a little glimpse of some of the ancient material. I'll be really interested in questions about the ancient stuff, feedback and thoughts about narrative medicine, because I'm sure that many of you are deep into that in ways that I'm not, whether by reading or by experience, right? And sort of how you're thinking about medical practice for yourselves. So thank you very much. I look forward to conversation. Happy to talk about anything. Is narrative medicine part of medical school here? Yeah.
Can I ask you a question about, well, of course, the concept of privacy, as we know it, doesn't make sense from the texts that you showed us. Are there any boundaries from what you can tell about what people share?
That's an interesting question. I mean, so the boundaries in the ancient context are family boundaries, first of all. So when you talk about the Hippocratic corpus or any like real life medical engagements in the ancient world, it is always going to be at the discretion of the male head of the family. And there's quite a lot of anxiety in the Hippocratic texts, for example, about physicians, because they come into the house and they look at people, their bodies, their relationships. It's vulnerable to allow physicians into the house. So yeah, there is a sense of fear of crossing those boundaries. And it's the father of the household who would determine when and how they can be crossed. When these individuals are writing, I mean, that's what is partly what is extraordinary here, is that they're voluntarily, Marcus Aurelius and Fronto, Aristides for sure, and then the parents of this child, they are exposing that in ways that are somewhat unusual. And I say somewhat unusual because there's a bit of a discourse in the first and second century CE in the Roman period. People sort of think that, I mean, scholars now think that there is emerging a different way of relating to the body and different ways in which the body can be used to make professional and personal claims, including with the emergence of Christianity, the role of the body changes. But it is still oddly, it's an odd kind of disclosure. Yeah.
I had a question about, sorry, Steven, you want to go?
You're good.
I had a question about like if you have noticed any like trends or patterns in terms of whose like stories have been preserved historically. Are these people from a specific class? Is it mainly men? Things like that. So I just wanted to know your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great and important question. Mainly exactly what you said, elite and male perspectives. All three of the examples I showed you are like that. With the inscription, you can tell, well, you know, scholars of the ancient world can tell that money went into that inscription. So yeah, there's a certain class and gender bias there. And where you get other kinds of class and group representation and other gender representation and so on, it's often embedded within medical narratives, like or medical technical stuff like Galen and Hippocratic texts. So then you have to sort of read for like, what's the overlay of the physician's point of view? There's a certain amount of material, and as you say this now, I'm like thinking, it's time for me to look again at the papyri from the first, second century CE and see like what people have been turning up in personal letters and stuff, because that is garbage dump material. It's stuff that survives for the archaeological record because it was disposed of. And there you don't have the same class bias. And so I'm not aware of a ton of that material being in there, but it is where we get more information about other people's experiences. And other than that, archaeology, which is non-narrative, right? It provides material evidence for scholars to create narratives about, but doesn't tell stories. So yeah, it's tricky to get past that bias. Yeah. Thanks. Another question?
Yeah, it seems like all the examples you portrayed here were physical illnesses. I was wondering if there was any records of like diseases of the mind, and like, did they rationalize those in different ways? Were they more like doctor's accounts or patient accounts?
Yeah, they're interested in that stuff for sure. And it's basically, I'm just trying to think, are there any first person accounts of mental illness from the ancient world? And I kind of have a feeling there's probably a little bit somewhere that could speak to your question. Among the elite, like a sort of Seneca, elite philosophers writing. Galen, I'm not sure if he writes in the first person about this, but mostly it's in medical texts and it's in fictional, like drama and those kinds of texts. So they're definitely very interested in mental illness in an artistic context, a literary or performance-oriented context, arts, basically. And then medical writers are interested in it. Galen has lots of case histories inside his medical writings, stories about patients, and he diagnoses what's wrong with them. He also says what they tell, talks about what they tell him. But yeah, non-physical and mental illness is of great interest to physicians and people in general in this period. Yeah, actually, yeah, okay. Rufus of Ephesus, who's interesting because he is very into talking to his patients. He's like an exception in that regard. He has a whole text on interviewing your patients. We have fragments of it. He also has a text on melancholy, which is one of the ways that they thought about mental illness. That's not personal so much as it is theoretical and medical. So yeah, they're interested in it. And some people, just to say one more thing, some people think Aristides is like complaining about physical illnesses, but really has some kind of, I mean, that's modern people reading a kind of hypochondria into his text, which is different from mental illness per se, but yeah. Thanks, yeah.
To your knowledge, is this particular like arrangement of physician-patient disease in the triangle preserved throughout the Mediterranean, or is this mostly, at least the way that you've described it, in like Greco-Roman terms?
It's a good question. This is the material that I know best. It would be very interesting to take that question to other contexts, right? We don't have the same kind of, for this period, we don't have the same kind of writing about medicine and illness in other contexts, like Egyptian material. We have material from the Near East, Near Eastern traditions, surgical texts, ways of thinking about medicine in the temple context, remedies like plant remedies, pharmaca, basically medicines and so on. But the sort of philosophical kind of approach to medicine that you see in the Hippocratic corpus is a little bit unusual for this, like the Mediterranean world, like broadly speaking, across this period of say about 500 years. But like, yeah, that's interesting. And people are interested in kind of various sorts of comparisons and comparative work between Greek medicine and Chinese medicine, no contact, but contemporary work. And I don't know what that looks like in that context. So yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, is this, yeah, what other ways can we imagine the interaction? Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Was the role, excuse me, was the role of physician a highly coveted position in the ancient times, and was it always in the context of religion? Like, did they operate under some religious body?
They didn't operate under any kind of regulation. That would be the first thing to say. Scary, I know. So it was kind of a it's a freelance kind of thing in a way. There were guilds and associations of physicians and ways that they tried to enhance and sell their practice, but there's no regulation. They were not directly connected with the sanctuary context, the religious context I showed you, but there probably was informal contact and relationship there. And what was the other part of your question? The first part?
Were they highly coveted?
Highly coveted positions. If you could get to be a public, what's the word, like public physician in a city or town, you got a good deal of money. So there were positions like that that we can see in inscriptional evidence and so on. So yes, in a way. And then in the Roman world, though, how to say, I just kind of got tangled in my thought there. It's kind of a mixed bag because in the Roman world, most of the physicians were Greek. Depending on sort of how you personally think about the Roman Empire, right? That might or might not make sense, but basically, like coming from the eastern part of the empire are all these sort of Greek educated doctors offering to treat your ailments in Rome. And some of them look pretty good and some of them look pretty bad. And there's a little bit of a sort of mistrust of these Greek doctors at Rome, but that was across the spectrum. And somebody like Galen was highly respected. So in a way, your two questions go together because without regulation, it's sort of up to you to make the case for your services and to make the money you want to make. And now I'm thinking about medical billing and stuff, like to make the money you want to make or need to make. Yeah, so there's no automatic esteem that comes with it, but there can be pretty good esteem. Doctors also performed in competitions, like festival competitions. Yeah, that's a kind of a weird one. So in the Roman period, there were competitions, festivals for things. They would draw people from like all across the Mediterranean world, Roman roads, easier to get around, athletic festivals, poetry recitation, like so athletic competitions, poetry recitation competitions, and then medical competitions. And nobody really knows whether this is people getting up and giving speeches, or whether it also involves dissection, performance dissection, which definitely happened. Whether it happened in the competitions or not, we don't know. Mostly of animals, and seen some shocked faces, mostly animals, all animals actually, when it comes to dissection, sorry. So yeah, there was also a way in which being a doctor was worked into the performance practices of that period, and there's a certain amount of, you know, esteem associated with winning the competition at Ephesus for doctors. So yeah, but a mixed bag. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we can wrap up. Are there any
We
Zoom?
have two, yeah, we have two questions to do. One's quick. What is the date and the location of the epitaph?
The epitaph is from Rome, and I think from the first, can't remember if it's first or second century. It's at Rome and it doesn't have an archaeological context. So we can't really say sort of where exactly it came from and what its context was. It's all inference from the inscription.
And then do you see a connection in ancient narrative medicine and today's graphic medicine?
What's graphic medicine?
Uh,
Is that a term or is that like graphic detail? I don't know. Is the person offer?
Nadia Merritt, if you could, on Zoom, if you could explain what is graphic medicine? Or what do you mean by graphic medicine? I don't know if we're gonna get an answer.
Okay. Maybe not. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Very much.
There's gonna be a recording of it, like posted to the university library website in case anyone interested wants to look at the text again.
Oh, we have,
And take more pizza, there's leftovers.
when I answer really quick, graphic novels with medical context.
Yeah. Interesting. We have no illustrations from the ancient world for any of our texts, so it just, okay. Yeah. It's an interesting question for that reason.
The contract, how do you enforce it?
Okay, graphic medicine, I was just taking a look at the link here, we have no illustration, of texts from antiquity. Or contemporary texts, so, the idea of text and image, or like graphic novels and medicine isn't part of what we consider.
This is good, really.
I mean, it's drawn. Yeah, that's a good point. It'll be like, first question, and I guess.
Like 3 and 4 pages.
Okay.
About.